Hello, this is Mike Swanson. This is an episode of the Past American Century. In the last video, I talked about John F. Kennedy and the Central Intelligence Agency in the period after the Bay of Pigs, when the question was in the air, what are we going to do with the CIA now after they helped create this complete disaster? And Arthur Schlesinger was tasked with answering that question. Well, more was going on than just what was going to happen with the CIA. A big question was what was going to happen with the covert operations that the CIA was doing, like the Bay of Pigs, that used counterinsurgency, special forces even, but low-grade warfare or above. This wasn't just a couple agents doing James Bond stuff. And Kennedy decided, look, these CIA guys, they can't be doing stuff like this anymore. And into the picture rose Ed Lansdale, someone who is a huge figure in the literature, almost a mythical figure in many ways. In fact, just a few months ago, Max Boot wrote a book focusing on Ed Lansdale. Well, what I'm going to share with you is a power play that Lansdale tried to make. Oh, and by the way, if you've seen the movie JFK, Lansdale in that movie is the so-called X character. And if you want real detailed information about him, go to blackopradio.com and get the information and material about Fletcher Prouty on that website, because he has lots of things to say about Lansdale. But what I'm going to say is something not in the Max Boot book, and as far as I know, not even in the Fletcher Prouty materials. And this is a story that comes from a book written in 1999 called The Secret War Against Hanoi, author Richard Schultz. And Professor Schultz got material from the Pentagon concerning special operations during the Vietnam era, and some of this material touched on Lansdale. And this story I'm about to share with you comes directly from the book on page 282, and it's talking about the beginning of the Kennedy presidency in February 1961. In that month, Lansdale tried to take an attempt to take control of all military-style covert operations, all of them. So let me read these couple pages because they're very fascinating, and they actually suggest who was actually in charge of these things by the time of Kennedy's death, and even in the early parts of the LBJ administration. Let me read this to you. This is page 282 is where I'm starting. While Lansdale was persona non grata of senior military leaders in the Pentagon. Okay, I'm going to stop right here. A lot of people did not like Lansdale in the Pentagon. He worked, had a close relationship with Allen Dulles, did stuff with the CIA, but he was seen as someone who was after himself in many ways, or had his own agenda, even though he was a colorful and almost, you could say, famous figure even at this time. So here I go. But, and I continue from the book, he had his supporters on the civilian side of the Department of Defense, including Deputy Secretary of Defense Roswell Gilpatrick. In a February the 24th, 1961 memorandum to Joint Chiefs of Staff Chairman Lemnitzer, Gilpatrick directed that Brigadier General Lansdale be designated, established, and head the offices of Assistant to Secretary of Defense. In this capacity, Lansdale was to have responsibility for, quote, 5412 committee matters, special defense activities as approved by the Secretary of Defense, and CIA relationships and special interests of the Secretary of Defense. Now, you need to understand the 5412 committee was tasked with supervising all these sort of covert operations, and Lansdale was going to work for the committee and really be the point man controlling everything in effect. And the book says Lansdale was to be McNamara's action officer for all military involvement in covert special operations. His immediate boss, Deputy Secretary of Defense Gilpatrick, was McNamara's representative to the National Security Council's 5412 Committee, later the 303 Committee, which had policy oversight of all U.S. covert action programs. This put Lansdale at the epicenter of the game. A week later, Gilpatrick sought to strengthen Lansdale's position. He informed Lemitzer that, quote, General Lansdale as ATSD would provide staff for all matters related to 5412 committee actions. In that capacity, Lansdale would recommend appropriate items for discussion, monitoring, necessary follow-through actions required as a result of this meeting. Gilpatrick instructed Lemitzer to designate officers of general flag rank from the Joint Chiefs to provide advice and support to General Lansdale in the performance of his duties. None of this went down well with the Joint Chiefs of Staff. An intense fight ensued inside the Pentagon for control of covert operations. Lansdale fired the first shot from a memorandum to the Director of the Joint Staff, Lieutenant General Earl Wheeler, which he prescribed the most effective means of having the Joint Staff render support of his mission. With Lansdale operating under the authority of Gilpatrick and ultimately McNamara, the tone of the memo was clear. Wheeler and the Joint Staff were working for Lansdale. It stated, a small team of the Joint Staff will be activated under Brigadier General David W. Gray, USA Chief of the Subsidiary Activities Division Joint J5, members of the team, and it goes on. The author says, this was a straightforward power play called by Lansdale. In effect, Lansdale was trying to get himself positioned where he'd be working for McNamara and telling the Joint Chiefs of Staff what to do in regards to covert operations. Book continues. He was not alone in playing hardball. Joint Chiefs of Staff Chairman Lemitzer, in a March 4th memorandum to McNamara, reinterpreted what Lansdale thought Gilpatrick had decreed. They tried to push back on Lansdale. Lansdale then responded, and then this continues on. The author says, in a July 29 memorandum to Secretary of Defense McNamara and CI Director John McCone, the Joint Chiefs announced that a Special Operations Division in the J5 Directorate of the Joint Staff had been activated. The chief of this new division was to be kept appraised on all 5412 committee actions under consideration that involved the military. By taking this action, the chiefs thought they had inserted themselves back into the loop and put Lansdale back under their control and stopped his freelancing. So this may sound complicated if you've never heard of all these divisions before, but to put it simply, the Joint Staff works for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the Secretary of Defense has assistant secretaries that work for him. Lansdale got himself to be positioned under McNamara as an assistant in charge of all covert operations. He started writing these memos telling the Joint Chiefs of this situation. They responded to all this by ultimately creating their own division and putting Lansdale's division in advisory capacity under it. So that's how they fought back. Lansdale tried to fight them back, and so forth. I'll sum it up with this paragraph. Lansdale may have won the first round, but the Joint Chiefs were not about to give up. There was too much at stake. They could see the special warfare frenzy from the White House spinning out of control if they didn't exercise supervision of it. However, up to this point, the Chiefs, while under a lot of pressure to take up President Kennedy's challenge, had been slow to do so. They looked like obstructionists, and JFK let the brass know of his displeasure with their lack of action. Okay, the Joint Chiefs of Staff weren't fans of covert operations and guerrilla warfare and all this kind of stuff. So, quote again from the book, Lansdale was out of control. As the self-promotional endeavors demonstrated, in their estimation, he was an eccentric aberration of what a general officer should be. Even worse, policymakers are listening to him. To undermine these developments, the Joint Chiefs adopted a new strategy of co-optation, which is when they create this new organization. From the book, the chairman, Joint Chiefs of Staff, directed the establishment of the SACSA. What this stands for is Office of the Special Assistant for Counterinsurgency and Special Activities, effective 23rd February 1962. To head the new agency, the Joint Chiefs, with the White House approval, selected Marine General Victor Brute Krulak. Krulak was to become one of the military's most skilled bureaucratic players in Washington, a figure of immense import in the constant struggle over Vietnam. Looking back on the 1962 to 1964 period, One can only marvel at the involvement of this two-star Marine general in high policy in Vietnam. His role greatly outreached his major general rank and attests to his political acumen. At the time, Krulak held mainstream views on the Vietnam conflict and military strategy. He was no fan of special warfare as promoted by Lansdale. From 1962 to 1964, Krulak was aligned with Joint Chiefs of Staff Chairman Max Taylor and Taylor's protege in South Vietnam, MACV Commander General Paul Hawkins. David Halberstam, in The Best and Brightest, wrote that during this period, what Krulak really did was serve as a messenger between Saigon and the Pentagon and represent the military in intergovernmental meetings, where his special assignment was to destroy any civilian pessimism about the war. Krulak had also worked himself into the position of a Kennedy administration insider. With Kennedy, he got a personal relationship with him. The book continues. For these reasons, Krulak was picked to be the special assistant for counterinsurgency and special activities. He was not selected because of his extensive background and operational experience in special warfare. Krulak had none. As SACSA head, he was the gatekeeper the Joint Chiefs of Staff wanted. In the counterinsurgency area, he deflected the criticism by U.S. officers in the field in South Vietnam who argued for a commitment to that approach for fighting the war. Instead, he followed the Taylor and Harkins line in 1962 that the United States was succeeding by adhering to conventional mainstream methods. Krulak strongly disagreed with Lansdale about special activities and covert operations. He would play a key role in the termination of the office of the Assistant to the Secretary of Defense and forced retirement of Ed Lansdale. However, it's important to note that Lansdale contributed to his own demise. McNamara and Gilpatrick lost confidence in Lansdale, and the book says others saw him as a grandstander, a lone wolf, and a self-promoter. In fact, the Max Boot book has a little story where when Lansdale retired, there was a retirement party for him held right outside McNamara's headquarters in a room just steps away, and McNamara, even though he was there, did not even thank Lansdale. He just walked by him in silence because that's what he came to think of him. Okay, so to sum up, if this is all, sounds like we're getting in the weeds here, and the simple version of this is Lansdale tried to create his own unit under McNamara to control covert operations. The Pentagon ultimately responded by creating an office of the Special Assistant for Counterinsurgency and Special Activities, SACSA, headed by Victor Krulak. Now, when 1963 comes, the book has this to say. During a May 1963 visit to several Latin American countries, the axe fell on Ed Lansdale. He received a message that the Pentagon had issued orders for his retirement from active duty. He had not been thinking about retirement and had not put in papers to do so. By the time he returned to the United States on June the 1st, 1963, he was officially out of the military. Lansdale was then ordered back on temporary duty until October the 30th to wrap up his affairs. The mainstream had finished off one of the military's most knowledgeable special operators, had done so with extreme prejudice. The SACSA then presided over the dismemberment of Lansdale's office. In a memo to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs on September the 30th, 1963, Deputy Secretary of Defense Gilpatrick, once one of Lansdale's supporters, assigned all responsibilities of the office of the Assistant to the Secretary of Defense to the SACSA. Now, the author of this book actually interviewed Krulak, and Krulak boasted of being the one that helped get Lansdale terminated or forced into retirement, I should say, while he's outside the United States visiting Latin American countries, and no ability at all to respond. And I'll leave with this quote from General Krulak himself. Some people thought highly of him. He's speaking of Lansdale, of course. Krulak continues. Some thought just the reverse. He was skillful in exploiting those who thought highly of him. I never quite understood how McNamara felt about him. If I had to guess, I would guess that he became very suspicious. I don't believe that the director of Central Intelligence had much confidence in him. I heard him say so informally on the golf course. So that's the real story of Ed Lansdale and the Kennedy administration, or a big part of the story that's hidden and missing and kind of forgotten, even though this book was put out in 1999. The other part of the story, of course, is Operation Mongoose and the mania that was and everything related to it. But I hope you enjoyed this segment of the past American century. And if you want more information and you've not yet bought my book, The War State, and if you want to learn more and support the show, buy the book, grab it, go to Amazon.com, type in The War State, order it, and I'll talk with you in the next video.